There is a formula that repeats in American financial history. It has 5 steps, and they never change. Create an institution for people who have no other options. Earn their trust, and then change the rules behind their backs. Take the money, and then blame someone else for the loss. On March 3, 1865, Congress created a bank for freed slaves. By 1870, white trustees had secretly rewritten its charter. By 1873, they had loaned the deposits to their own businesses. By 1874, they needed a fall guy, so they chose Frederick Douglass. He walked in as president and lasted barely 6 weeks. The Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company was chartered by Congress and signed into law by Abraham Lincoln, same day as the Freedmen's Bureau and its sweeping promises. The purpose behind the bank was deceptively simple. 4 million people had just been freed from slavery. Most had never been allowed to own a single thing. This bank would give them a safe place to deposit wages. The original charter contained clear protections. Deposits could only be invested in stocks, bonds, treasury notes, or other United States government securities. No loans permitted. The money would sit in the safest instruments the country had to offer. A board of 50 trustees would oversee everything. It sounded like a promise the government intended to keep, but read the fine print and the cracks were already there. All 50 original trustees were white. Not one was required to put up any personal security for the faithful discharge of their duties. The charter contained no penalties for failure, no personal liability for trustees who mismanaged funds, no mechanism for depositors to hold anyone accountable. Abraham Lincoln signed that charter. 5 weeks later, he was dead, and the bank he created was already vulnerable in ways nobody understood yet. The freed people trusted it. Why would they not? They trusted it because the bank's own advertisements carried images of Lincoln, Ulysses Grant, and William Sherman, official-looking, government-backed, or so it appeared. The passbook handed to every depositor told them this was a benevolent institution. The bank's newspaper declared, "You should use this bank because it is conducted entirely by your best friends." For people with no other options, people who had been legally prohibited from owning property just months earlier, that language was powerful. It felt like the government was finally keeping a promise. It felt like freedom was becoming real. So they deposited, week after week, dollar by dollar, sacrificing present comfort for a future they had only just been allowed to imagine. The numbers tell you how much they believed. Within 7 years, 37 branches opened across 17 states and Washington, D.C. Over 70,000 people opened accounts. Total deposits over the bank's lifetime exceeded $57 million. That is roughly $1.5 billion in today's money. Most individual accounts held between $5 and $50. $5, that was a week's wages for many of these depositors. Former slaves saving every spare cent from their first free labor. Black soldiers depositing military pay. Churches and mutual aid societies pooling resources. Dollar by dollar. $57 million accumulated. In 1870, in Richmond, Virginia, a man named Robert Harris walked into the Freedmen's Bank with his wife, Betsy, and their 2 children. Charles was 6 years old. Mary Susan was 11. Robert had been enslaved 5 years earlier. He could not have opened the bank account if he had wanted to because legally he did not exist. Now he was opening accounts for his children. When he sat down with the cashier, he gave his full name, his birthplace, his occupation, his residence. He listed the names of his wife, his children, his parents, his brothers and sisters. For the first time in his life, his family appeared in an official record, not as property, as people with savings. The bank required this information from every depositor: full name, place of birth, current residence, occupation, names of spouses, children, parents, siblings. For formerly enslaved depositors, sometimes the names of former owners and plantations. The records from 29 branches survive today. They contain approximately 480,000 personal names. This is the largest single source of lineage-linked African American records known to exist. Before 1865, enslaved people could not file marriage certificates or hold land titles. They were not listed by name in federal censuses. These bank registers are often the first time these individuals appear in any official document. Remember that. It becomes important later. Now let me tell you about May 2, 1870. If you were looking for the exact date the money started disappearing, that is it. On that day, Congress amended the bank's charter. The original rules said deposits went into government securities, safe, untouchable. The new rule said half the money could now be loaned out for real estate investments. The man who lobbied Congress for that amendment was Henry Cook. He chaired the bank's finance committee. He was also the territorial governor of Washington, D.C., appointed by his friend Ulysses Grant. He sat on president of First National Bank in Washington, which was Jay Cook's local office. He sat on the board of the Seneca Sandstone Company. He sat on every side of every transaction that followed. He was the bank's guardian and its predator at the same time. And Congress approved the amendment without increasing oversight by a single dollar. Someone might say, banks fail. The Panic of 1873 destroyed thousands of businesses. Why treat this differently? Because this was not a market failure. The original charter made catastrophic loss nearly impossible. Money in government securities does not vanish in a financial panic. Someone had to change the rules to make the money accessible. Someone had to move it from safe investments into speculative ones. Someone had to loan it to themselves. That is not a bank failure. That is something else entirely. Follow the money. Henry Cook deposited up to $500,000 of the Freedmen's Bank's cash at First National Bank, Jay Cook's office. The Cook brothers paid 5% interest on that money. The Freedmen's Bank promised 6%. That 1% difference came directly out of depositors' savings. $50,000 went to Jay Cook and Company for the North Pacific Railroad, secured by worthless bonds. Another $50,000 went to the Seneca Sandstone Company that Henry Cook organized. He sat on both boards. $224,000 went to the contractor building the bank's own lavish headquarters, a $260,000 brownstone building on Pennsylvania Avenue, paid for with depositors' money. Bank officials approved personal loans to themselves and their associates. And here's the detail that should make your blood run cold. The few black depositors who tried to borrow from their own bank faced far stricter collateral requirements than the white men draining it. By 1873, roughly 75% of all loans were overdue. The vault was nearly empty. The books were fiction. And then came September 18, 1873. Jay Cook and Company declared bankruptcy. The North Pacific Railroad could not repay its debts. The Panic of 1873 swept the country. Henry Cook had already resigned as governor 8 days earlier, on September 10. He saw it coming. The Freedmen's Bank was among the first institutions to lose everything. Historian Wright White put it plainly. Some of the first people to lose everything in this crash were freed slaves from the Civil War, and they lost it because of Jay Cook and Henry Cook and their corrupt bargain. March 1874, the white trustees knew the bank was dead. They had watched the numbers collapse for months. Their solution was not to confess. It was not to return the money. It was not to warn the depositors still lining up at 37 branches across the country. It was to resign and install Frederick Douglass as president. Think about what that means. The most recognizable black man in America, a former slave who taught himself to read, an abolitionist whose name carried more moral authority than perhaps anyone alive, a man who had spent his entire life fighting for black freedom. They put his name on a bank they had already killed, so that when it collapsed, his would be the face depositors remembered. Not Henry Cook's, not Jay Cook's, Frederick Douglass. Douglass didn't know. He walked into the magnificent brownstone headquarters on Lafayette Square, across from the Treasury, near the White House. He described seeing its towering height and perfect appointments. He wrote that he felt like the Queen of Sheba when she saw the riches of Solomon. He invested $10,000 of his own money. Then he opened the books. He found what he later called a corpse, far more in loans than in deposits. outstanding debts that would never be repaid, less than $40,000 in actual cash, $400 in bonds. He told Congress to shut it down. I need to pause here because there's a version of this story that is simple. White men stole black money. That is true, but what keeps me up at night is the records. 480,000 names, the first time most of these people appeared in any official document. Names of spouses, children, parents, brothers, sisters, former plantations, former owners, the most detailed genealogical record of post-emancipation black life ever compiled, created because the bank needed to identify depositors' heirs in case of death. The institution that stole their savings preserved the names. The same crime that destroyed their savings left behind the most comprehensive archive of who they were. And the people whose names filled those records never got their money back. June 29, 1874, the bank closed. 61,144 depositors had roughly $2.9 million in their accounts. The bank had less than $50,000 in cash, $3.5 million in outstanding loans that would never be repaid. A secret loan of $33,366 was approved the day after the bank formally closed, approved by actuary George Stickney, without authority of law, without advising the trustees, without consequence. Congress investigated, recommended indictments for Henry Cook and others. Not a single white trustee was ever charged. Between 1882 and 1920, bill after bill was introduced in Congress to reimburse depositors with federal funds. Several presidents expressed support. Every single bill was blocked by white Southerners in Congress. Every one. In 1927, the Treasury announced remaining assets were depleted. No further payments available. Case closed. In 1939, 65 years after the bank collapsed, a man named Henry Thomas was still writing letters. He begged the NAACP to lobby Congress for the 38% his family never received. Douglas spent the rest of his life carrying the blame. He later called the experience a connection which brought upon his head more abuse and detraction than any other part of his life. He called the bank the black man's cow but the white man's milk. In 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote that the collapse did more damage than 10 additional years of slavery could have done, not just to savings, to faith, faith in institutions, faith in the idea that freedom meant something tangible, faith in the possibility of building something that could not be taken away. The depositors lost more than money. They lost the first proof that their labor had value in a free economy. They lost the records of their own thrift, their own discipline, their own belief that tomorrow could be better than today. And the nation that chartered the bank shrugged and moved on. Maybe I am connecting things that do not connect. Maybe the Freedmen's Bank was just another casualty of a volatile economy. Maybe the Charter Amendment was just bad policy, not coordinated theft. Maybe installing Douglas was genuine desperation, not calculated misdirection. Maybe the 40 years of blocked reimbursement bills were just politics. But when the man who rewrote the charter is the same man who received the loans, coincidence stops being convincing. When the investigation recommends indictments but no one is charged, something is wrong. When every attempt at justice is blocked for 4 decades, I stop reaching for innocent explanations. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Today, the FDIC estimates that black Americans are unbanked or underbanked at roughly 3 times the rate of white Americans. Financial researchers call it a trust gap. They study it like it is a mystery, like it appeared from nowhere. It did not appear from nowhere. It started on June 29, 1874, when 61,000 people learned that the government's promise was not worth the paper their passbooks were printed on. The Freedmen's Bank building stood on Pennsylvania Avenue, across from the Treasury, near the White House, the most prominent financial address in Washington. It was demolished in 1899. The Washington Post ran the headline, "Monument of a Crime." In 2016, the Treasury renamed the building on that site the Freedmen's Bank Building, a plaque on the corner. That is what $57 million buys you 150 years later, a plaque. But inside the National Archives, the records survive.
480,000 names, searchable, digitized, available on Family Search and Ancestry. If your family was Black in America between 1865 and 1874, your ancestors may be in those records. Names that were never written down before emancipation. Family connections that slavery tried to erase. The men who stole the money are forgotten. The depositors' names endure. So I am left with questions that do not have comfortable answers. When Congress chartered a bank with 50 white trustees, no personal liability, and no penalties for failure, was that an oversight or a design choice? When Henry Cook simultaneously ran the bank's finances and his brother's investment firm, and Congress allowed it, was that negligence or permission? When the bank collapsed and they handed the keys to Frederick Douglass, was that desperation or strategy? When every bill to reimburse depositors was blocked for 40 years, was that ordinary politics or something more deliberate? And when we study the racial wealth gap today without ever mentioning the Freedmen's Bank, are we investigating history or continuing the erasure? I keep returning to the records. 480,000 names written down by people who had never been counted before. Names of mothers and fathers separated by slavery, listed together for the first time. Names of children born free, recorded beside the plantations where their parents had been held. Those records were not created out of kindness. They were a bureaucratic requirement of a doomed institution. But they survived, and the money did not. $57 million, 61,000 depositors, 0 prosecutions, 480,000 names in an archive. The evidence is there. The records are open. The question is whether we are willing to follow where they lead, or whether 150 years later, we are still doing exactly what the trustees did, taking the deposits and walking away.